Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Arnav Joshi. I'm a data lawyer at Clifford Chance, and I'm joined by a wonderful team of colleagues here today, which includes Nicole Kidney, who's a fellow lawyer in our data practice here at Clifford Chance London. We're also joined by Georgina and Ahmed from the ICO, who are both principal technology advisors and have been very closely involved in some of their recent guidance and developments, especially in the children's data protection, AI, and transparency related guidance. We're going to be hosting somewhat of a unique session here today that touches on those recent pieces of guidance, how they intersect with things that we're seeing as a market practice, how some of our clients, both big and small, have adapted to this guidance, what best practice looks like, but also things like what tensions emerge and how we work through them. The way in which we're going to be presenting this is in the form of something called a lightning sprint, which is something entirely fictional and something we've sort of conjured up in the last couple of weeks as we designed this session. And I'm going to hand over to Georgina to explain just how we've done that.
Thanks, Arnav. As Arnav mentioned, Ahmed and I have been involved in the Children's Code design guidance that came out in September that was really aimed at helping practitioners implement privacy and think about children's privacy throughout the design process, and think about some of the design changes that you can make to products and services to make them more privacy protecting. And so we came up with this idea of a lightning sprint because we want to show some of the activities that you might run as part of developing your product or service that would show how you could prioritize privacy alongside those development practices that you might already be doing. A sprint, for those of you who aren't aware, is an approach to developing software, developing digital products and services that allows you to sort of prioritize one issue or feature to develop, one challenge or problem to solve in a constrained time. And it means that you are prioritizing and really focused on that issue, and you are testing and iterating and learning as you go, rather than deciding on the solution from the beginning and ending up with something that maybe doesn't work as well at the end. So that's a bit about the sprint. Obviously, we only have an hour. Sprints in practice can last anything from 5 days to a few weeks. So we're not going to be able to cover everything, but hopefully we'll just give you a flavor of some of the activities that you could run, and really how you make and take policy and privacy and data protection into practice. Over to you, Nicole.
So we'll be running the session using a Miro design board, which you can see is being shared on screen now. For those of you who haven't used it before, Miro is a collaborative whiteboard platform. So throughout the session, you'll see us add post-its and notes on the board in the same way you might during an in-person sprint. We also want this to be a collaborative session, and we really welcome any input you might have. So at certain stages in the design process, we'll prompt you for your ideas. And then if you can add your thoughts into the Q&A function, then we can pick those up and add them to the board for discussion.
Cool. Thank you, Nicole. Nice to virtually meet you all. So today we're going to go for a hypothetical prototype, and I'll explain what that prototype is in a moment, but it's a child-focused AI-powered app. We're then going to do some of the thinking about the legal and ethical principles that we're going to consider. Then afterwards, we're going to do some design challenges through the framing of a couple of how might we's. Then we're going to go over to do some project planning over the 8 weeks, and then we'll have a kind of live product that we're ready to ship, and then we'll talk about some future roadmaps of products that we're interested in. So that's going to be the session. I'm going to, if you move over, Georgina, we're going to talk about the actual app that we are developing, and it's an app called Skill Seas, and we want to develop a new feature. So this app is a learn at home public speaking, singing and drama skill trainer. So you'll go onto the app and hopefully you'll improve your public speaking skills. We offer in this app one free bite-sized lesson, and then children can ladder up to a subscription or model, or there are ads to pay. The app will include some real-time feedback through a chatbot or a voice assistant, followed up by a human tutor. It's important to consider these features as we go into the development, so do take note. The app's going to use the phone camera. It's going to use some augmented reality, and there'll be an optional gaming console computing power. And finally, to reach out, to get our engagement needs, we're going to have a minimum of 5,000. We need a minimum of 5,000 active users for the recommendation to run optimally at the beta stage. And worth considering that this app is designed for 13 to 15-year-olds. So I'm going to move over to Georgina.
Just wanted to also reiterate, this is an entirely fictional app, just in case. And we are, of course, imagining that we are a design team. We've just received this brief to develop this new feature for Skillseas. And these are the next steps that we would take to start designing and thinking about the key privacy issues. So the first thing is your user group. A requirement of the Children's Code and the Children's Code design guidance is about creating age-appropriate designs for your users. So it's really important to think about your specific age group who are going to be using the product or service, and think about their specific needs around privacy and data protection. Now, we developed some tools to help think about those specific needs, and I can share the links to those later. But one is called age-appropriate mindsets, and it helps you think about some of the data protection issues for different age groups, for different mindsets of children. If you were running this as a usual design sprint, this is where you would start. You would want to understand your users, your user needs, so that whatever you were designing would meet those needs and would be something that 13 to 15-year-olds would want to use. So let's start here and imagine, after receiving our design brief, we've just been sent our user research report from our research team, who have prioritized some of the aspects that they want us to think about when we're designing for this age group. So the first thing they want us to recognize is that the age that children are able to give consent for sharing data is 13. So for many of our users, this might be the first time, or one of the first times, that they've been able to give consent for sharing data. Another aspect is that this age group is starting to be more independent, and they might think, and they might overestimate their ability to cope with risks and assess different risks that arise from online behaviour. So that's something to bear in mind. They also are starting to distance themselves from parents and guardians and really find that independence. So they might be less likely to rely on parents and guardians for support if they do want to understand more or have any concerns about a service. So they want us to really think about how we can signpost towards other sources of guidance if we need to provide that extra support, as well as pointing towards parents and guardians as a source of help. In the way that we communicate any explanations or privacy information, we can still encourage to use audio and visual content, as literacy may still be developing at that age. We need to offer options for more or less detailed explanations. So as well as the simple explanations, give options for greater detail, more support to understand an aspect with more information and more support. So those are some of the high level themes that our research team are urging us to consider. Curious to hear from the audience if there's anything that you think we are missing here to think about privacy needs and behaviours of 13 to 15-year-olds. So yeah, let us know any behaviours that you think would be worth keeping in mind for how this age group might interact with an app like this, that was helping them improve their public speaking. Just going to wait to see if anything comes through on the chat. If not, then we can move on. This gives us a good overview. We're starting to think about the mindsets that this age group might be in, and how we can start to design interactions that help them understand what's happening with data. Okay. Should we move on? I don't know if anybody else can see any input from the audience, but if there's none, we'll take that as a good overview to get us started, and let's move on to the legal and ethical principles and considerations.
Thanks, Georgina. So as part of the design brief, we received a report from the legal team reminding us of some of the key legal and ethical principles which we must keep in mind, in particular as we're hoping to use artificial intelligence when designing this product, and also we'll be using it for children. So we've pulled out some of these principles and posted them on the frame here. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with these concepts from a legal standpoint, and how we need to ensure the processing of personal data satisfies data protection principles such as data minimization, purpose limitation, accuracy. And from an ethics standpoint, this is by no means an exhaustive list. I'll let Arnav speak in a bit about how the legal and ethical principles cut across each other. But first, I'll just give a few examples about how we can proactively use these principles when designing our product. So we must ensure end-to-end accountability in the AI model. We need to avoid a scenario where the AI system is a product of a complex supply chain, which involves data platforms, designers, software engineers, marketers, and technologists, but no one is accountable for standing behind the product's compliance. Transparency and explainability are, of course, fundamental principles that should underpin all AI design, but especially design of products that will be used by children. Since artificial intelligence can often seem unintelligible to us, we need to make an extra effort to ensure that children using our product are aware when AI is being used and can begin to understand how it reaches a particular decision. And then finally, the data needs to be handled and managed in a fair and responsible way. This means as well preventing bias in any outcomes by using a diverse and representative data set when training our AI product. So for this product being, a speech-related app, we don't want a situation where we've trained it using only, for example, the voices of boys from London. And then we find that when the product's being used by girls or children with other accents, that it can't actually process their voice accurately. So this just gives us a very brief snapshot of how valuable these principles are and how we should be thinking about them proactively during the design process.
Thanks, Nicole. And just to pick up then on the ethical principles, now to most, if not all of you, I'm sure it comes as no surprise that these look very, very similar, if not entirely sort of identical to each other in most instances, and there's good reasons for that. Much of data protection law, not just in Europe, but increasingly all across the world, is informed by human rights law and by fundamental rights, which is the very same thing which in turn tends to be informed by long-held ethical beliefs and principles and sort of philosophical underpinnings. This is the reason that there is that common thread that cuts across ethical principles and practice, and also the legal considerations that we make sure that we do account for instance, in this process, in the design process. The thing that we find most helpful in contextualized for European data protection, which includes the considerations that Nicole's just given us an overview of is it helps us have more nuanced, more meaningful, more in-depth discussions around some of the things that can end up sort of perhaps not being considered in as much detail as we would like running through processes, or it can help get sort of broader buy-in from the business, from multiple stakeholders, and having that more holistic, comprehensive, multi-stakeholder conversation at this stage, and also then at every stage of the process, is incredibly important. When we look at discussions around, for instance, fairness, harm, agency, oversight, what it means to be accountable, who should be accountable. These are discussions that are very much embedded and expected from data protection law, but it does help to use the ethical principles and underpinnings to have some of these conversations as we go along this process in a little bit more detail. And with that overview, we're going to move on to the next frame, which is the mapping board, and I hand back to Georgina.
Great, thanks Arnav, and thank you Nicole. So where are we so far? We've understood some of the needs of our target age group and some of their behaviours around privacy. We've looked at some of the key legal issues and ethical principles that we want to prioritise and think about. And for this sprint, we're going to focus on transparency, explainability and fairness as the principles that we want to focus on. But of course, there are all the rest that Arnav mentioned. But for this activity, we'll focus on those. And what we really want to do is think about the design challenges or issues that might relate to those topics as we're designing this new feature for children. And just to remind you, the new feature is an AI-powered tool that analyzes speech and body language to give you advice to improve your public speaking. To help us think about the design challenges, we've come up with how might we questions or design questions that really open up your thinking, and rather than thinking about solutions, think about key questions or topics that you might need to consider. So the first question that we want to tackle in relation to transparency and fairness is how might we choose the right information to help children understand these automated decisions? It's also worth saying, if you were running this in reality, you might give this workshop an hour and a half, say, and you might run it with designers and data protection teams together so that you have a really cross-disciplinary conversation. And you could, if I was doing this in reality, I'd give everybody sort of 5 to 10 minutes in silence to jot down their answers to these questions, and they would start putting post-its on the board. Obviously, for this session, we've done some thinking already, so I'm going to open it up to the group to talk about what are the things that we should be thinking about for this question, and also what are we trying to avoid. So as well as designing intentionally and thinking about what we do want to communicate and prioritize, we also want to make sure that we're avoiding those risks. So team, let's start thinking about what information we need to communicate, or we could communicate to children around how automated decisions are made. Would anyone like to
Sure,
start?
Yeah, I can start. Sorry, a quick sort of housekeeping thing for the interactive bit. If you're able to, if the audience could please ask their questions and comments or sort of suggested post-its in the Q&A function, which would be on the left-hand side banner of your screens, then that'll feed through to us, and we can put them up here. So I guess I can start with one of mine, which would be
if you want, I can add the post-its, Arnav, as you're talking. Maybe that's
sure,
easier.
Yeah, so I guess one from me would be to understand what is and isn't AI, like where the where the children or the users actually interacting with an element in the app which is AI and where isn't it. For instance, where it's a chatbot, or where they're getting where their sort of biometrics or facial features or voice inflections may be being assessed. I think the points in that sort of interactive timeline, if you will, where it's AI versus not is an important early one to flag for me.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And when AI is being used, or when automated decisions are being made, we should try help the child to understand kind of what information about them is being taken in, and kind of what's happening to that information to reach a certain decision. So taking our product as an example, we could think about what information does the AI use? So for a public speaking task, the child's voice and its body movement is going to be recorded through the microphone and the phone. And then what does the AI do with that information? Well, it kind of, picks up different variables and dependencies, which result in different outcomes. So again, using speech as an example, it could look at your tone or your body language, your eye contact in the child's performance. And then those variables would be scored, and the AI would give them a decision on their performance. So helping a child to kind of understand how that process works can be really important.
Just to add to that, I think also not just, to be transparent for compliance sake, but also as an opportunity, it can be really interesting to understand how an automated system is making those predictions, and you could almost use that as a really engaging interaction and a useful interaction for you to learn how to improve your speech as well.
I think one other point that I want to add is around agency of the child. So if there's an unexpected result, or they don't understand anything, how do we give the child a prompt, some help to kind of give a further inquiry, or just to really give them a helping hand.
And do you kind of think that, do you reckon that would be in the manner of saying, here's how you can get some help, or should you maybe sort of speak to a parent about it? I guess it depends on the age and just how much detail they want.
Yeah, so definitely recommend thinking about how you can develop the child and parent interaction model there. But also, as the research says, that the child might be tempted to not involve the parents. So how do we build the interface, build a mechanism within the interface to allow the child to find out more, or get some further help, maybe with directly the app team or something.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea, and that can also kind of provide us with that extra information about what isn't necessarily being working well, and what where children are frequently looking for a bit more information.
Great, thanks. And how about things that we want to avoid?
If I jump in here, this could potentially have complicated technology, so definitely want to avoid jargon language, and try and keep it as not too simple that it kind of devoids of all meaning, but do it in a way that is understandable to the child.
Yeah, and I just add that the sort of tests for these things are reasonably clear, in the sense that there's a lot that's been happening in the post-GDPR era when it comes to privacy notices. A lot of organizations have made really good progress, some haven't, but a lot of these continue to be sort of throw information at people that even adults wouldn't understand in most instances. So the main one would be to not make it look like fine print and sort of overload. For that to be an information overload for children, it needs to be, like we discussed, sort of bite-sized, relevant, age-appropriate information. So anything that's more complex than that, which are reasonably direct sort of tests to be able to apply, I think, is something that absolutely should be avoided.
Yeah, and I think that segues really nicely into our next how might question. So once we understand what information we want to share with the child, then we need to think about how we should present it to them. So typically adults' privacy information online is usually in written text, but children may have certain challenges kind of fully understanding that. So for our product, we need to think carefully about other more creative ways to convey the privacy information, bearing in mind the target audience being early teens. So on one hand, as Georgina mentioned, maybe a bit more independent and experienced using online products, but also on the other hand, starting to move away from consulting their parents in certain decisions or asking them if they don't understand something. So how might we design these age-appropriate explanations?
So I think part of that is those options for finding out more or learning from external sources, and being able to scale up and scale down the information that you're seeing, so that you can have more detail if you want to, and at the time that is most appropriate for you. So I suppose these explanations you can come back to and dive in to when you have more time or are in a better frame of mind to engage with privacy issues. Other things to think about here are, so we were talking about letting children know when their voice is being recorded. I think for the design of those interactions needs to be quite careful, because you could have a sort of ambient signal that would show somebody that their voice is being recorded, or you can create a really active interaction so that somebody has to, hold down a button to record, to start the recording process. So I think really thinking about how somebody understands that the recording is taking place, so that it doesn't happen just in the background, is something that would be worth considering here. Any other design considerations that we want to think about how we would communicate some of these aspects to children?
I guess one, just going back to the sort of what is and isn't AI. One thing that I've not seen any really amazing examples of just yet is the use of sort of commonly accepted iconography. Perhaps one of the reasons for that is there isn't any commonly accepted iconography just yet for like how would you display AI that you are interacting with an automated decision-making system. And I think exploring that, because just given that it has a lot of recall value, educate people around that iconography, so that instead of having to give a huge amount of information and disrupt the user journey potentially when they're using the service, we could explore developing a sort of education and transparency system around icons, so that when those are displayed, most users know either what's going on or where to look for more information easily.
I'm really pleased you brought that one up, Arnav. I have mixed views about iconography. I think in some cases they can work really well, but in other cases they can be misleading. And if you aren't aware of what the icon means, then it's really hard to understand what's happening. So I think I would just urge people to, this is where bringing children's views into the process is really key, because you can start to test some of these icons in your product and service and see how people understand them or not. We'll get onto how we test this in the next part, but I just wanted to touch on that, the part that you were talking about. How do you show somebody that this is an automated decision, and that an AI is kind of analyzing this data? And I think it's really important from a user experience point of view as well, because if you receive a result that you're not expecting, and you think and you don't know how it's been made or why, it's really hard then to be able to challenge that result. If you know that it's an automated decision, and say you understand that, okay, that it might be less accurate in dark rooms or in certain situations, that gives you the tools to either correct that situation and get a better result, or flag to get support that there is an error in the way that this automated system is making decisions. So actually having that clarity about how the automated decision is made and how it works is useful from a user experience perspective, because it helps you navigate those errors that are bound to happen. And that is, there's a term called graceful failure that's used in product design and software development, which means that you expect those bugs, those errors to happen with end users, and you design for them to be able to correct course and get support. So I think that's as equally as important when you're designing with AI as well, because those bugs and those errors will happen. So how do you design for someone to understand what's happened, that it is an AI system, and for them to correct? Any other topics to add to the board? Also from the audience, if you've got any suggestions, we'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
There are some questions in the Q&A apparently.
If someone else could read them, because they're quite small for me, that would be helpful.
I'm not seeing them. Where are they? Oh.
I think it's in one of the screens on the right-hand side. I don't know if it's quite small.
My eyes are terrible as well.
Yeah.
Oh.
I wonder if someone might be able to just share some of those in our speakers chat. Just so
How will the app be funded? I can read just about.
Great question.
This is very important to communicate to the child. Sorry if I'm not quite reading it perfectly, but it's very small. So should we talk about the funding of the app and how we're going to communicate to a child? And then not text, I think I can read. It's got to be communicated in an engaging way. Video or cartoon, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea, using cartoon or an animated character kind of showing. We've seen it done really well before, kind of showing the character using the product, and also like through pictures what's actually happening in the background with their information, and then finally kind of watching the character then escalate it to, you know, a chatbot or a human interface to try get a bit more information. That can work really well to really kind of engage the child in how they would also kind of raise an issue they might see. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, agreed. And a really good point there. Also, someone on sort of funding. So I guess the linked question there is if it's a subscription model, and I think Amit touched on this earlier on, if it's a subscription versus an ads model. And I think, yeah, the design really covered that it could be a bit of both. You could either subscribe and have an ad-free version, or have one that includes ads. And I think we will at some point cover the fact that transparency around not just advertising but profiling, where we get into the realm of interest-based ads, is critical. And you'll see as we get to the decision-making point, the outcomes slides soon, that those are sort of very, very important considerations that very much form the baseline of information that critically must be provided.
And there's another really good question, actually, that Catherine's thank you posted around. We're all taking privacy as read, and it's really important. How do we communicate? Well, I should really actually accurately. How can we make sure they're clear on why privacy is important, as they may not fully understand the consequences of sharing the data? Really important point.
These are great. I've added them to the board there. And perhaps it's through using these more engaging methods that we can help people understand privacy. I think also it's important for this communication to be in context, and that really helps you understand some of those consequences of data sharing. Often we talk about privacy as being important. We talk about it in the abstract, but it's in context of those decisions. We're about to collect this data to perform this analysis. It makes it easier to understand potentially what's going to happen, because you know exactly what data will be shared and the purpose. So I think also helping to explain some of these in context can be really helpful for making those sort of privacy issues more tangible to people.
Agree. And I think one thing that I don't see enough is, again, in a sort of different context, going back to the standardization point that I was trying to make earlier, is we do see a lot of people reinventing the wheel in different ways. So lots of great apps and services out there. Obviously, many large companies tend to be sort of competitors. Everyone's competing for the most user-friendly, the most increasingly the most privacy-friendly and the most trusting service. But they're using, for instance, government guidance and, for instance, child rights organizations to supplement the information that you might be providing that's bespoke to your specific service. You could expand that out in ways that we'll discuss in a little while. But I think acknowledging the rest of the ecosystem that sits alongside yours is also very important, because that information and that messaging around the importance of privacy needs to be standard. So it shouldn't be something that for company A, you see privacy explained in one way, and then as the child starts to use a second app or service, suddenly you're thrown with a whole other new set of information.
Yeah, I love that contribution. Your product does not exist in a vacuum. It's part of a number of other products and services and interactions that a child might be experiencing. So it's really important to think about how the way that you're explaining these concepts might fit in or be influenced by other explanations. Just moving on to the final point then. So we've thought about the information that we need to communicate, and we've thought about some techniques and mechanisms for doing that. How do we test this? How do we know that the design decisions we've made are effective? Any suggestions from the group here?
Just quickly, sorry, just to go back one step, Georgina, something I think is really important to be clear about what we want to avoid with the explanations is inappropriate nudges, and that especially if we're doing any data sharing, and that we present the options as neutrally as possible, and just being really conscious of how we're asking the child to interact and making sure they're not doing it in any kind of nefarious way or dark way, I should say.
Exactly. Perfect. Thanks, Ahmed.
I think for me, one important point to make here would be not just how, but for how long and how much. And what I mean by that is that there's, for obvious reasons and understandable reasons, usually a good rush to make sure that things are built, tested, and deployed in timelines that it's commercially viable. There are market needs. There's lots of user research saying, you know, we do, and we understand those pressures. But it's very, very important that the not just the design of the product overall, which is more of a no-brainer, but the more sort of privacy and design considerations around transparency are that enough investment and testing is done on these points early on, rather than having to do them after the fact. Because when you have to do that, whether in response to things like customer complaints, it could be regulatory issues, it could be new guidance that starts to emerge and tells you exactly how you need to be doing things, it's much better to build these in to your process and spend that little bit of extra time making sure you've tested really well, rather than having to redo things later on.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe just to speak here a bit about how you might do testing some of your prototypes with children, because another part of the Children's Code design guidance is about how it's so important to bring children in as part of that design process. But obviously recognizing that many groups won't have done any user research with children before, and actually it's an entirely different approach and process than just doing user research with adults or testing designs with adults. We've got some guidance for how you can do that, and some links to practical tools for helping you run user research with children on the Children's Code design guidance work. But yeah, I mean, there are different mechanisms to do it, and that will need to be assessed as part of the product that you're designing, the age group that you're designing for, the data protection risks that you're looking at. So there'll be different models that will be more appropriate for different products and services. But as I say, tools and support for how you can run user research with children and parents can be found on the design guidance site.
Just to go one step further on from that as well. So as well as it's really useful to communicate with subject matter experts, like child development experts at this stage as well, just so that their considerations are put in place and they can have a really good representative of how different children, not the kind of, I know it's kind of 13 to 15 but there are different needs that a bit more nuanced that we might need to think about as well.
It can also be really beneficial to involve parents or guardians in the testing to make sure that, you know, they think that we've adequately represented the information, and that also there's kind of the privacy information that they need. And as well as that, also kind of identifying opportunities in the child's experience with the product for the children and parents to discuss privacy. This can also, when you're having these kind of interactions with the parents during the testing phase, can be a good time to understand whether they would expect there to be any kind of parental controls in place, kind of around usage or things like that. So consulting with parents in this way can be really important to help the kind of support the parent in protecting, you know, the interests of their children.
Yes, exactly. Everyone can see my poor spelling. Need to be in place. Great. Okay, let's move on then. That was really great. Thank you, team. And you can see how this activity might be, you could spend a lot more time thinking about those really interesting challenges that you might like to tackle in your sprint. So just moving on then, we just wanted to show you how you could expand these activities and across a longer project and start to plan some of those key moments and perhaps user research with children. Think about that as part of your process and your planning going forward, because this isn't just an activity that you run, you know, once out of the project. Really, to see the value of this, you need to be prioritizing privacy and planning it into weekly prioritization meetings. You need to be testing some of your privacy information designs early on and getting input from children. So I think it's worth just, and we won't probably have time to do this as a group planning activity, which is how I imagine it could be run. But you could do this as a cross-disciplinary group to work out how you collaborate with your data protection and legal teams throughout the product design stages, so that you get that input throughout and not just at the end once the product's been designed. So we've just started with some questions here that might trigger some of the elements that you might like to plan into your process. So when will key decisions need to be made in your product design process? That can be related to this feature as well. It doesn't just need to be about privacy. It's about recognizing when those key moments are in the product design process and making sure you use that as a checkpoint to say, have we considered these privacy risks? How have we designed interactions that help children access their rights and mitigate those risks, and making sure that everybody is happy with the way that those interactions are working, and meeting those needs and mitigating the risks. So really important to think about privacy in those key moments. Thinking about involving children's perspectives throughout the design process. So that's something that we've touched on already. It's also worth thinking about how those interactions with children might change over the course of the project. So in the initial stages, you might be involving children to help you come up with ideas for how you explain different parts of the AI, and it's more generative, it's more about co-creation. And then as you're testing the designs, you're designing research to be more about watching children engage with your prototypes or your mock-ups to see whether it is helping them understand more about those explanations. So there's something there around how you design that engagement with children so that it helps you make those design decisions at different parts of the process. And then, as I've mentioned, collaborating with your data protection teams and legal teams? Can you involve them as part of the design process? So after you've done your user research with children and you've tested your privacy information, could you invite your data protection officer to the synthesis session so they can see how children are engaging with privacy information, and really making those next steps and deciding on those actions together, rather than teams being siloed and people not understanding why decisions need to be made. So that's a very quick overview of how you might look ahead at your design project and think about some of those key moments, key decisions, and planning in for a more collaborative design and legal approach to thinking about children's needs, best interest, and prioritising privacy. Wish we had more time to go into that, but I'm going to move on now to Arnav to talk us through how we've done at the end of our sprint.
Thanks, Georgina. Yeah, really good job of condensing 8 weeks into into about 5 minutes. So as we get into this, so this is where we try and, again, with the caveat that this is highly hypothetical and it doesn't include everything that we could, should, would think through and come up with. But this is just the bit where we sort of do a little bit of a reality check and give you a sense of where a project like this would most likely have ended up. These are not all of the points that we would have ended up with, but the ones that we thought it would be helpful given the lens that we're putting on this to focus on. I think to begin with, the one thing I'd like to highlight, just sort of given our experience working in this space for a while now, is we appreciate the fact that, you know, there's a lot always going on, not everyone in the business, and there are many stakeholders beyond people in legal, people in ethics functions, people in design functions, a lot of people increasingly, and it's great to see that pick up privacy and ethics as core to their ways of working. But there are lots of stakeholders involved. There are a lot of tensions. There are time pressures. There are budget pressures that go into making a lot of these decisions. And as advisors, and I'm sure Georgina and Ahmed will speak to this, but also as regulators, the rest of that ecosystem that sort of looks inwards from the outside are conscious of that. It's obviously always best to shoot for gold. And the best, that the most aligned you can be to the practice is the ideal situation to be in. In this instance, for instance, were we to have actually done this and get this to a beta stage in a live environment, we think that we would have landed on a position where we would have managed to get something like 2 weeks of design resourcing from the general pool of designers available to the client to come up with this bespoke 60-second animation. And I know someone had rightly provided that feedback in one of the earlier slides. So we do think that that's an important one, and that's a win that we think we would have been able to convince the business to achieve, given guidance on also sort of user research and best practice. Another one that's becoming increasingly important, not just in children's privacy context, but overall, is providing clear decision points and making sure that users are not being nudged into making decisions that they shouldn't be making. That could be in relation to advertising, as the next point touches on. It could be in relation to profiling that may be happening in relation to your app. There's usually a very thin line between what could be a so-called good nudge, if that's such a thing, or a bad one. And that's things like decisions, making clear decisions on what that could and could not be is critical. And we would have managed to make sure that that's something that's very clearly considered. On the right hand, you'll see things that we think are on the roadmap. This is again informed by some of the guidance that we're seeing, but also things that we're seeing in practice, and a lot of the good stuff that we're hearing from our clients, for instance, on investments that people do want to be making. One of them, going back to one of the earlier points that I was making on on creating a sort of an ecosystem around children's privacy, but privacy in general, and making more investment would be something like a privacy hub for children and parents, where you can get access to things like other resources, basic information on what privacy is, in what context is your data used, not just potentially on for sort of company A, but others. So we'd like to see something like that come up as an ecosystem surrounding this app. Gamifying AI explanations so that something like sort of closer to real-time explanations can be provided to children would be one really helpful way, subject to testing, of course, to see go live. And what that would mean is, if you've made a decision, if you've got some feedback saying, here's your score on how you've, for instance, done on this this speech that you've just tried on the system. Here's how you can sort of tweak things around, perhaps using counterfactuals, for instance, to give people a sense of what the options are and why they've actually ended up where they are, rather than having to send an email to someone and get sort of loads of text trying to explain the specific decision or intervention. Exercising rights continues to be a fairly complex area, again, mostly driven by having to send an email to someone, lots of lawyers getting involved, and then getting a sort of, boilerplate style response back. Aiding children in the meaningful exercise of their rights and sort of creating not just the paper layer, but the stakeholders that are needed within the organization to make that happen is very, very important. And then the last point, and again, something that's built into most design journeys and increasingly also legal reviews, is to go back and take a look at how well you're doing. That will mean more user research. It will mean speaking to people within the organization. It will be tracking lots of the great guidance that continues to come out through regulators, for instance. And it's very important to go into the program, I think, bearing in mind that you will need to, would and should be conducting these reviews at regular intervals. And with that, I think we're at the end of our session.
There's one question I have, I think is useful to address that Catherine just posted, which is in the design process that we've just conjured up, is your design process more costly, money, time, and outcome than those who do not prioritize privacy? And if so, how can these costs be mitigated in the long run?
I'd love to get the group's view on this, but I can start. So I think it's difficult to ascribe specific costs in terms of money, time, and outcomes. I don't think the outcome cost is more. From my sort of genuine perspective, and then this may be more of a personal view than a professional potentially, but I do think that making the investment early on, this goes back to one of the points I was making earlier, making that investment early on in the design phase and the sort of the build phase of your app makes sure that you're a much lower risk of having to redo things either in the product or having to then make sure that you need to go back and respond, for instance, to requests from customers or rights, exercises of rights, or potentially sort of bad PR that may come off the back of things that have been launched without having fully considered some of the things that we've touched on here. So I think when we look at it more holistically, making the investment early on retains, and if not retains, builds greater trust. It gets you ahead of the competition. And when we, in most instances, when we look at this sort of after the fact, it costs a lot more to fix the issue, as in most instances, than to make sure that you account for them going in.
I would just add to that also, this process, these activities that we have created and adapted really are based on common design practices and approaches. So it's designed to fit in with the way that you're designing products anyway, thinking about user needs, mapping design challenges and framing design challenges. But it's just ways of thinking about privacy alongside that process that you would normally go along anyway. And as Arnav says, creating products that have privacy as part of that experience gives a better experience to people, to children at the end. You know, like pop-ups and tick box options for giving consent or understanding data, the way data is being used, and are not good experiences for anybody. So improving this process and this approach will improve your product experience in general.
And it's just, you know, on the long run point, I think given that we are something like 3 years out of the current sort of breed of data protection regulation, for instance, once this is deeply embedded into your design practices and your legal reviews, etc., and how the business tends to think of these issues, once it's BAU, it's a sort of the returns are much greater, and it requires that much less investment, because then you know what to do each time, and you're only incrementally making further changes as you go along.
It's also worth saying that we are developing this design guidance and want to hear how people are using it and if it's useful. So please do get in touch if you have any questions, or if you'd like to be involved in future projects and helping us develop these tools.
Thanks everyone for joining. If you would like to get in touch and share further feedback or have any questions for us, our details are on the board now, and that lets us hand back to Catherine and the Tech UK team. And I've been asked to let everyone know that there will now be a lunch break until 12:30. So wish we could have seen you there in person, but for now, enjoy lunch.